Good morning. Many of you who know me know that I'm pretty driven by grades and that I try really, really hard in school, much to my own detriment, probably. But it wasn't always so. In fact, when I was in school, especially middle school and high school, I didn't care at all about grades. I mean, I cared less than any healthy person should. Often, in fact, I would even throw my homework away at the first trash can that I saw walking out of class. I would do the work that they would give me in school while I was there, but I just felt like it was some kind of violation that I'd have to take anything home and do it on my own free time. And so I never did, but I usually aced the tests, and most of the teachers knew that I was learning, even if I didn't care about grades. But one day I got a teacher who didn't know me that well, and he thought that I had cheated on the test. And so he called me into his office and he accused me of cheating, and I was confused because I didn't really care about grades, and I thought, wow, you got the wrong guy here. I mean, I didn't even care about grades. Why would I even try to cheat for you? And so he made me retake the test. And he had me in the classroom all by myself, and he was watching me the whole time take the test. And I remember being so angry by that. I felt so violated. I felt like I was persecuted. And every time I answered that test, my blood was just boiling. And when I handed the test in, I had gotten a near perfect score on the test before, and since I retook it, I actually finished the whole thing off and got a perfect score. And I could see the look on his face. He never said he was sorry, but I could see the look on his face at the end, that he knew what he had done. But I was really angry, this kind of teenage angst meets this sense of injustice, that people had thought that I had done something wrong. And when I read Mary's words here about accepting God's will in this way, knowing that she would know as a teenager that people would get the wrong idea. They would get exactly the wrong idea. The way that God was calling her to be faithful was a way that would make her look really, really bad. And so she responds here with, I am the Lord's servant. May your word to me be fulfilled. And those are some bold words. I mean, those are bold words that make my little experience in school look like nothing. I mean, we're talking about a life-altering thing, becoming pregnant with a baby, and having an entire village of people think that you were an immoral person and that your baby would be illegitimate and would reject you. If my daughter was a teenager and she came home pregnant and she told me that God had made her pregnant and that she would have the Messiah born in her womb, I mean, come on, who wouldn't be really, really skeptical? But that's what Mary was called to do. And in ancient Nazareth, you want to kill your daughter for something like that? I mean, you want to kill her? In ancient Nazareth, that was actually legal and expected that you would. I mean, that's the kind of facing death decision that Mary brought with her in her radical act of faithfulness. And so, but Mary doesn't seem upset as cosmic forces invade her life and change it forever. She doesn't shake her fist at God like you or I might as a defiant teenager. She just humbly accepts God's will. She simply obeys. And I think to miss that crucial point of the story would be just sad, because it's just such a monumental thing that we just glance right over. And we might ask ourselves, why would someone do that? Why would someone just simply obey a radical command from God like that? Sure, the angel telling her the message would probably help with a little bit of her unbelief. But part of the way that I think that Mary didn't make a huge fuss over it, about God invasively borrowing her uterus, so to speak, was that it wasn't just that it was God telling her what to do. It wasn't just this big authority telling her what to do, and she was afraid, so she just did whatever God said because it's God. I don't think that was all that was at play in Mary's decision to follow what God's plan was. I think Mary was a part of the people who were longing for the Messiah. And she was longing for the Messiah to come too, and she was probably honored that God had invited her to be a part of this big plan that he had. And she longed for God's reign to finally come in ways that we, as Americans, wealthy Americans, could probably scarcely imagine. We just palpably longed for the Messiah to come, waited millennia for the Messiah to come. And Mary wasn't just obedient. I mean, she was waiting for the Messiah too. Last week, we talked about kind of the next part of the story, and it's kind of backwards because we're going back to what the angel told Mary. But we talked about the Abrahamic covenant, how God had called Abraham and had made this covenant with him, a covenant about God blessing the whole world. And Mary's song of response to that was the Magnificat, about this call for God's justice to work in the world. But here Mary actually mentions a different covenant, the Davidic covenant. She's looking at this other history. The first covenant was about Genesis and how Abraham and his descendants, Isaac and Jacob, had been blessed by God, and this covenant kept changing and growing. And then later with Moses, it came to include the law. It came to include these rules that people were supposed to follow. And then there's this other huge section of the Old Testament, this history of from 1st and 2nd Samuel to 1st and 2nd Kings, about this another expansion of the covenant to include the monarchy, the rising monarchy of King David. And so in this huge section, we see God calling up and raising up this crazy new thing that he's doing. Because at first it looks like the monarchy is something that is a rejection of God, something that God hates. But then in the Davidic covenant, it turns out that this is something that God had planned all along, something that the way that God would rule the world. And so I won't read the entire section of the Davidic covenant here, but in 2 Samuel 7, this is where God is giving this covenant to David. And to give you a little bit of context, David really wanted to be the guy that built the temple. I mean, that was his dream. He had conquered all these enemies around him, and that was his dream. He wanted to build the temple. And so God sends Nathan the prophet to him to tell him that this wasn't going to be what was going to happen, that his son Solomon would actually be the one that would live out David's dream. And so that's how the proclamation comes, but a whole lot more than that is laid out as God explains to him this covenant. And so Samuel writes, "Now then, tell my servant David, this is what the Lord Almighty says. I took you from the pasture, from tending the flock, and appointed you ruler over my people Israel. I have been with you wherever you have gone, and I have cut off all your enemies from before you. Now I will make your name great, like the names of the greatest men on earth. And I will provide a place for my people Israel, and will plant them so that they can have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed. Wicked people will not oppress them anymore, as they did in the beginning, and have done ever since the time I appointed leaders over my people Israel. I will also give you rest from all your enemies. The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever." And so in this covenant, we see God's promise to David that he would reign through his line of people. And it's this radical expansion of God's covenant. You know, and some of the things that God promised David did come into being in David's lifetime. He did find a secure place for his people to live at that time. God did grant David rest from his battles. But some of these promises were not fulfilled at that time. They could only be fulfilled by David's descendants, Solomon and others. God promises to establish a house or lineage of David. He promises to establish a kingdom and a throne that would become everlasting. Beyond the mere human kingdoms that rise and fall, like we always see on the news today. And rather than the monarchy being something that God hated, it was something that God had been planning maybe all along, that God would use for God's glory, the way that God would rule forever. And after David hears these words, he has this prayer, and he responds something like, how can this be? I'm just a mere person. I can't live forever. How could this come about? And it's really setting the stage for the Messiah who would come, and it's setting the stage for the incarnation of Jesus. a descendant of David who could truly reign forever. And over time, the people, they grew to long for a Messiah, just like Mary did. The Jewish people experienced great idolatry with Solomon, and it fractured the kingdom, and then both of those kingdoms got carried off to exile. And in the close of the Old Testament and the opening of the New Testament is about 400-year period where Israel was conquered 8 different times, starting with Alexander the Great and ending with Julius Caesar. And there was this little time in the middle of that where the people drove out the Assyrians. This man named Judas Maccabeus rose up, and people thought maybe he was the Messiah because he came like a political ruler. And he drove back these Assyrians, and they had this 90-year little golden year of peace, where people looked back at that time and thought maybe Judas Maccabeus, maybe he was the Messiah. And so this hope for a political Messiah who would come and liberate the people from the Romans grew and grew and grew and became the sole focus of what people were expecting when God would return. And this was a hope, I think, that Mary shared. A hope of God's reign that would include into the people's experience some of the things that were provided for in the Davidic covenant. Safety, security, rest from their enemies. The thing was, though, when Jesus came in the incarnation, he brought a completely different kind of kingdom than people were expecting. He didn't come as this big political leader. He didn't come to set up a kingdom that came by force. He didn't come to fulfill all the people's expectations. He was talking about the kingdom of God. He was not meaning what they were thinking he was meaning. And that's why a great many people missed the Messiah when he came. Even the closest disciples at the beginning of Acts, they're waiting. Jesus is about to ascend into heaven after the resurrection, and they're like, wait a minute. What about all that political stuff? When are you going to restore the kingdom to Israel? And Jesus just, he gives us a commission. He gives us this great commission to bring the kingdom into the world, but he doesn't do anything that they were expecting. He just leaves them there staring up into the sky wondering what happened. And so Jesus talked about the kingdom of God, the reign of God, but he meant something completely different. Napoleon Bonaparte, there's this quote from him that was just so striking. He says, "I know men, and I tell you that Jesus Christ is no mere man. Between him and every other person in the world, there is no possible term of comparison. Alexander, Caesar, Charlemagne, and I have founded empires. But on what do we rest the creations of our genius? Upon force. Jesus Christ founded his empire upon love, and at this hour millions of men would die for him." As the incarnation demonstrates, Jesus brought an upside-down kind of kingdom down from heaven. Rather than a royal palace, Jesus starts out in a backwater. Rather than, he comes in a smelly manger with smelly animals, falling from the throne of heaven to that. And from there, the kingdom never takes on the trappings of power that we might expect. He never takes on the trappings of royalty like we would know them or want. Jesus emptied himself, the scriptures tell us, and he took the form of a servant. He laid down the power of God to become a man. He laid down the majesty of sitting on the throne of heaven for the humility of growing up in the eyes of the people of Nazareth as an illegitimate carpenter's son. God had a big surprise for those people who were waiting for the Davidic covenant to be fulfilled. He enacted a very different kind of kingdom. A kingdom where love and weakness, rather than power, was the true source of strength. Where justice and peace don't come from taking up the sword of oppression. A kingdom where the first would be last, and the last would be first. And there are still parts of the covenant to be fulfilled, still some of the things that Israel was waiting for, we wait for, in Jesus' second coming. But I think it's time to ask ourselves if we've even truly accepted the things he enacted in his first coming. Mary accepted the words of the angel. She was willing to do her part, as painful as that would be to her. But when we fast forward 30 years, we find her wondering if Jesus had lost his mind because the kingdom came in a completely different way than even she was expecting. So this Advent, this Christmas, I invite you to welcome in the kingdom of God. A kingdom built on the power of love, not on the power of fear. A kingdom with room enough, not just for the choir of the heavenly host, but for the outcast shepherds and the foreign scholars who traveled from the east. A kingdom without end that pushes the boundaries of our imagination and asks us to follow God into completely uncharted waters. Christmas is a scandalous story. Don't let the Hallmark cards fool you. It's the story of a God who loved a sinful world and loved it enough to go on an all-out rescue mission to save it. The story of the God of the universe stepping into time and space just to be with us. Christmas is a riches to rags story. A story about a God who emptied himself of the trappings of royalty and power and took on the form of a servant, took on our own human experience, who willingly traveled from the most exalted throne in the universe to a lowly manger, and even from there to a cross. If nothing else, Advent can teach us that there's no shortcuts to the kingdom of God. We can't just cut to the end of the story where we start to get our comfort and safety needs met, like the people from Israel did. Sometimes we just have to do what Mary did and tell God yes first, even though we don't really know what we're getting ourselves into. We have a choice to make. We can accept the gospel that is proclaimed to us and, like her, say, I am the Lord's servant. May your word to me be fulfilled. Or we can keep looking for another kind of kingdom. Kingdom with all the trappings of safety and trappings of power that we might expect. A kingdom that politically seeks to govern the world from the outside rather than transform all of us from the inside. The kingdom of God, the real kingdom of God, is not about power coming from the outside. It's about the power of God coming like a mustard seed, coming like a human baby lying in a manger. It's a story of God's love taking the form of weakness and daring us to follow God even there. So as we go into our time of open worship, a time of listening to God, how he might be speaking to you, I challenge you. I know we have a lot of newcomers here. If you feel like the Lord is asking you to share something, you have the opportunity to do so. You can stand and a microphone will be brought to you. Please wait for the microphone because there are a lot of people who are hearing impaired that won't be able to hear anything that you say if you don't wait for that. So I just invite you into this time of listening, of waiting.